his PhD in 2003 in Agricultural and Biosystems Engineering from University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He researches water management and water quality impacted by agriculture. He kind of does everything, but a few of his job descriptions are he's the group leader of the Ag Water Management Research Group. He's the associate chair for the Research and Extension and associate professor in the Agricultural and Biosystems Engineering Department here at ISU. He was a key player in the ISU science team, which in 2013 prepared the science assessment for the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy. He's the Dean's Professor in the College of Ag and Life Sciences here at ISU. And today he will be talking about soil and water quality benefits derived from prairie strips. Thank you, everybody. Welcome.
All right. Thanks for everybody for coming out. And I think that you have Randy Kolka to blame for me being up here because Randy was going to do the talk and couldn't come down, and so asked if I could talk about what we found with some of the soil and water quality benefits associated with our STRIPS project, which is science-based trials of row crops integrated with prairies. When Lisa Schulte-Moore in your department sent out the call for what should we call our Prairie Strips project. And so it's a large team project. Many folks from NREM are part of the project. I'm going to talk mainly about the eco-hydrology and some of the biogeochemistry side that a number of folks here at Iowa State and also ARS and the Forest Service, Randy Kolka, work on. But you can see a number of people that work on this project that we've had going on since, the treatments I'll talk about since '07. So the overall, hypothesis is that we can strategically place small amounts of perennial cover, in this case prairie, into our row crop landscapes and have disproportionate of benefits. And so I'm going to talk about those eco-hydrology aspects today, and other people can come and talk about the biodiversity and various things, or maybe have already. So, so our project is at the Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge, and we have 12 small watersheds down there, anywhere from about 1 to 10 acres, where we're monitoring the water quality and soil quality associated with our treatments. And so for those that have been down there, here's the Prairie Learning Center. Here's what we call Site 1, that's the Orb Weaver site. Site 2 is Basswood, and Site 3 is the interim site. So it's right near where the interim headquarters for the refuge was when they first started down there. Okay, our treatments that we're looking at are a corn-soybean rotation with no prairie. So there's our 0% prairie or 100% row crop. It is in no-till, or it has been no-till since the treatments were established, and I'll mention about treatment establishment and such. Then we have a watershed, or watersheds, so 3 watersheds actually, with 90% crop, 10% prairie, with the prairie at the foot slope position of the watershed. Then we have one with 90% crop, 10% prairie with the prairie distributed in strips as we move up slope. So some of those watershed have a foot slope strip and then just one midway, and so it'd be 5% at the foot slope position, 5% in prairie at that mid slope position. And then we have one with 20%. So 20% of that watershed in prairie, 90 or 80% in row crop. So traditional corn-soybean rotation, common fertilization rates between about 130 and 160 pounds per acre to the corn crop for nitrogen, really crop removal rates for the phosphorus and potassium out there. So the only disturbance to the land in the row crop areas is injection of anhydrous so it's the nitrogen is injected as anhydrous, and then when they do the planting out there. So other than that, since '07, no disturbance. Okay, so one of the things, and certainly in NREM, Tom Eisenhart's here, and he and Dick Schultz have done a lot of work on buffers. And so one of the things is, really what's unique about this. I think it's building on a lot of the previous buffer work that's been done. But one of the things that I think is somewhat unique about this is that we're really under completely natural flow conditions. We're not assuming uniform flow. We're allowing the water. You can see here is a drainage way through there. You know, we have concentrated flow coming down and into our prairie strips. And so we're not controlling that flow in any way. It's very much of a natural flow condition. So one of the things that's kind of interesting, and even though we think that that's the way it would happen in reality, is we start looking at some of the previous buffer work. I did my research on buffers when I was at Nebraska, and this was, you know, you read some of the buffer work out there, and this is kind of the assumed flow into that buffer zone. It's nice and uniform across the whole leading edge of the buffer. Now, when I was in Nebraska, that's exactly how it worked on the setting I was looking at. Only because it was a furrow irrigated crop field, and so there were nice little furrows that directed it uniformly into that leading edge of the buffer. But as we start to, you know, we put this uniform width buffer in there, but in actuality, you know, our flow, we have areas of converging and diverging flow, and so we have an area of converging flow right there. So to this area of the buffer, you know, there's quite a big contributing flow area, all right? So why don't we look at putting greater buffer area in those areas where we have greater contributing flow? And so we might look at a variable width buffer design. And in reality, that's really what we did at Neal Smith, is we put more of that buffer in those kind of flow channels rather than a uniform width along the whole stream or field margin. And if we wanted to put one upslope, we might be able to put a contour strip up there, kind of parallel. I did not draw this very well because it really should be parallel to that bottom one to allow for good farming operations, or for allowing kind of uniform width between those buffers for farming operations. If they're planting on the contour, then having a uniform width, perhaps 2 sprayer passes or something like that to allow for good field operations. Okay, so our site history at Neal Smith. Until the fall of '06, the watersheds that I'll show the results for were under a brome grass cover. At that point in time, the farmer that we're working with, Gary Van Ryswyk, went in and tilled all these areas uniformly, and then came back in and seeded soybeans in our cropped area, and actually seeded prairie then in July of '07 into our prairie strip areas. And so actually you can see this is where there was some regrowth of that brome, and then he killed it again with glyphosate, kind of with his spring herbicide on those soybean acres. So they weren't again, this was just, those were tilled the same as everything else. It's just that there was some regrowth in those areas in the spring of '07. We did start to instrument those watersheds in '05 and '06, although we didn't have any flow. So there was really no pre-treatment data collection because we didn't have any runoff from the watersheds. As I said, no-till corn soybean rotation. The size, as I mentioned, was about small of 1 acre, I guess, to a large of 8 acres. With a slope from 6.1% up to 10.5%. So we're talking about some watersheds that have some slope, but certainly I think driving around pretty representative of the land area down there. Okay. So what have we been doing for surface water monitoring? Each of the 12 watersheds have an H-flume and an auto sampler. So we're able to sample a small portion of all the runoff that comes out of those watersheds. Actually, what we did for the sampling for this is it's based on the flow. And so every 1 millimeter of water flow from the watershed, we're taking a 300 milliliter water sample. And then in the sampler, there are 24 1-liter bottles. And so we're actually taking 300 milliliter samples that's composited into a 1 liter or 900 milliliter sample, so that we can hopefully get a little bit of all the runoff that that happens out there. So it's not a time-based sampling frequency, but really a flow-based sampling frequency. Now we think, especially if you were out, it'd be nice if you could get a nice visual of being out there. But when you think of 1 acre, or maybe up to 8 acres, and then you look at these flumes that are about 2 foot high or 2.5 foot high, you wonder, could we ever get runoff or that much runoff through there? And in fact, I had a couple colleagues on the eco-hydrology team that said, Matt, I think you over-designed those H flumes. They do not need to be that big. And we've had them flowing about 1.8 foot in a 2 foot H flume and 2.3 foot in a 2.5 foot H flume. So they were designed, there is a reason for engineering design principles out there. So we found out about those. And we filled, in fact, in 2010, we filled all 24 bottles and then some, missed some at the end of the event because the 24 bottles wasn't enough. But generally, we've been able to capture the whole samples from the whole event with those 24 bottles. Chris Whitty is the field coordinator for the project, and Chris started in the spring of 2010. And I think he never thought sample collection would stop, because I think there was sample collection 2 or 3 times a week that year. Okay, so what have we seen from a rainfall perspective? We've seen above normal rainfall in 2008, in 2010, 2010, and in 2008, I guess even 2011, a bit above normal, and especially 2010. So some have said we've had a couple career years in 2008 and 2010 for studying the benefits of these prairie strips, and I think that's completely true. So what have we seen from a surface runoff perspective? And this data, most of this data is actually published. Virginia Hernandez, that was a postdoc working in NREM and with Heidi Asbjornsen and I, published in the Journal of Hydrology looking at the runoff. And what we found is that where we have those prairie filter strips at the foot slope or in the contour, in contour strips, we're able to reduce overall surface runoff volume. We have about, on average, maybe a 50% reduction in the volume of surface runoff where we have these prairie filter strips. She also found some reduction in the peak runoff rate and some delay in when that peak runoff rate starts, okay? Now, one of the things, though, is that we had a student in 2011 that did measurements of saturated hydraulic conductivity, even some unsaturated hydraulic conductivity in the prairie strips and in the row crop areas, okay? So we see a reduction in runoff. We then went out and we measured infiltration under saturated or unsaturated conditions in the prairie strips or in the cropland. We saw no difference in the saturated or unsaturated hydraulic conductivity between the prairie strips and the row crop area in those years. So about 4 or 5 years post implementation. Because one of the things would be, okay, we see maybe we have a faster infiltration rate where we have the prairies areas versus the corn. So we see a reduction in runoff. We didn't see a change in the hydraulic conductivity, either saturated or unsaturated, in the prairie strips. So why would we still see a reduction in runoff?
Is it held in the plants?
Okay, that might be one might be held in the plants, or maybe water uptake by the plants, right? Greater water use by the plants, perhaps a greater water use by the plants, perhaps our soil moisture conditions are lower in the prairie, so we have greater water storage capacity for the next rainfall event. That's kind of what we've found as far as the water storage capacity, is that Jose Gutierrez, we don't know, the paper is in review, right, Tom? But he found lower soil moisture conditions under the prairie than in the adjacent cropland, which would indicate greater water storage capacity for that next rainfall event. So that would be one way. Vilma's been looking at plant water use of the prairie versus the corn. And
actually, I found something similar
okay.
In the comparative size. I was
Yeah.
working in prairie and crop,
Yes.
and prairie
Yes.
side, so that allows the prairie to capture more
Capture,
water.
yep. Yep. Okay. And there's another mechanism that I think might be at play here as well. So as that water runs down the slope, it hits that grass and slows down, and we get some ponding. And we may have more opportunity time for infiltration then, because we have some ponding conditions at the upstream side of those prairie strips. And you definitely see signs of ponding. There's a lot of sediment deposition on the upstream side of those prairie strips. Okay, so I think that's kind of a couple of the mechanisms why we see a reduction in surface water runoff. Okay, as we look at sediment export, then cumulative sediment export, we misspelling in the legend there. Our black curve is the cumulative sediment export where we have 100% row crop. The others, cumulative sediment export where we have the mixed use systems. Is there any difference? Just a touch, right? So we see greater than 95% reduction in sediment export from the watersheds with the prairie filter strips. This is just came out in the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation here recently. One of the things we've not seen much difference between if all the prairies at the bottom are in the foot slope or whether it's distributed in contour strips. Now, over time, I think we may see some additional benefit of having it distributed, even from a water standpoint, just because we'll get maybe some natural terracing effect of those upslope contour prairie strips. So I think over time, we'll even see some benefits on the water side of those. Okay, now we've looked at also phosphorus loss in that runoff. So this is total phosphorus. So a lot of it is sediment-bound phosphorus, but we've seen greater than a 90% reduction in total phosphorus export from the watersheds with the prairie filter strips. And so, in 2008, we lost about over 25 kilograms per hectare of phosphorus from the 100% row crop, and we lost less than 5 kilograms per hectare of phosphorus from the mixed-use systems. And certainly we see, really is driven by those years where we have a lot of sediment export. 2008, a lot of sediment export, a lot of phosphorus export. If we look at then you can see kind of the difference in phosphorus concentrations for individual events. On the top panel there is the 100% row crop system. The bottom one is the 20% prairie filter strip. And you can see, our maximum concentration where we had the prairie filter strips was about 7 or 8 milligrams per liter of total P, where we're, almost upwards of 40 milligram per liter of total P for one of those events in 2008, where we had the 100% row crop watershed. If we look at total nitrogen, we see similar kind of results. This is the total nitrogen on the unfiltered sample, so a lot of the sediment bound nitrogen, and we see greater than 90% reduction in total nitrogen export from the watersheds with the prairie filter strips. Little loss in 2012, no surprise, a drought year, but big loss in 2008. And again, if we look, go into the nitrate. So the nitrate dissolved with water, we see a reduction in nitrate export from these watersheds with runoff, but it's really a similar magnitude as the reduction in surface runoff. There's not kind of the trapping that we see on the particulate, so this dissolved. We generally see a reduction similar to the reduction in runoff that we see, but we do see some reduction. What I think is really interesting about this is you can see in 2010, we still lost about 10 kilograms per hectare of nitrate in surface runoff from our 100% cropland system. And what's somewhat interesting, if we start looking at this, is that in 2010, we had concentrations in that runoff all the way up to over 20 parts per million or 20 milligrams per liter of nitrate in that runoff water. Whereas if we look at all those other years, maybe one gets up to 10, but usually we're down about kind of 1 to 3 parts per million in that runoff water, which is really what we generally expect from pure surface water runoff. So why do you think we might see, and we even saw it where we had the prairie filter strip in 2010, we still saw elevated, almost up to 20 parts per million of nitrate in that runoff water. Why might that have been so high? Because as I mentioned, generally we think of surface water runoff of low in nitrate compared to, water that's moved through the soil profile, leached through the soil profile. Anybody have any idea why that might happen?
That water was late in the year, right?
Actually, you know what? No, actually not. This is, here's the start. This is a good point. Here's the start of 2010, and there's July 1st of 2010. So most of this was happening in May. Yeah, May to early June.
When is fertilizer
Fertilizer application,
application?
that was corn that year. It would have been in April.
Could be.
Yep.
Perhaps water is seeping, these are sloped watersheds, the water is seeping from the faces into the prairie buffer strips carrying nitrates with it.
I think that's exactly right. I think what we had, because at the top of the watershed, Chris Whitty, that again I mentioned, that was the year he started. We were trying to dig some pits for some zero tension lysimeters, and the water table, even at the top of the slope, was 1 foot below the ground surface almost until July 1st, because it was so wet. And I think every time we got rainfall, we had infiltration up above, and we had some re-expression of groundwater further down in the watershed that had higher nitrate in it, and then we saw that loss in that surface water runoff. So it really kind of highlighted in that really wet year that we were getting probably some seepage and then kind of a lateral seepage face down further on the hill. So it kind of explains the hill slope hydrology in a wet year, how that water may move. So I think it's kind of an interesting aspect that unless we had had a really wet year of 2010, we wouldn't have seen. It would have been interesting to see what would have happened if it was a soybean year. So you could completely rule out the fertilizer application. Yeah. Unfortunately, we've had the 2 really wet years that we've had were both in corn years. Yep. So that's. Okay, one of the other things that we've been monitoring is shallow groundwater at the kind of the top of the watershed and then at the foot slope position of the watershed. So in those where we have the prairie cover, we have shallow groundwater wells at that foot slope position. And what we've seen is that, prior to our treatment implementation, we saw really no difference in the nitrate, which is what we'd hope since all the watersheds were under brome grass cover. We'd hope there's no difference. In 2007, even after we had started to implement the treatments, we didn't see much difference. But then in 2008, here's our nitrate concentration at that foot slope position of those watersheds that don't have any prairie compared to those that do have prairie. We see 08, 09, 2010, 2011, and 2012, much higher nitrate concentrations in that shallow groundwater, moving below the foot slope position of those watersheds with 100% row crops. Now, the challenge is that we don't have a measure of how much water is actually moving through that zone. So it's difficult. We know there's a concentration reduction of the water that's moving below that prairie strip at the foot slope. We don't know how much water it is that's moving there. So we can't say how many kilograms per hectare are kept out of the stream, but we do know there's a reduction in nitrate concentration of that water moving below those buffers at the foot slope position or those prairie strips. Does that make sense? Yep. So it'd be really nice if we could quantify how much water that actually is. And so, I could have made this a lot easier. A picture is worth 1,000 words. Jose Gutierrez took this picture in June of 2008, 4-inch rain. there's what it looked like, 100% row crop, 10% prairie, 90% row crop. We do have a couple companion watersheds, 100% prairie, and that's what it looked like. This has been, I would say, a real eye-opener for the farmer that we're working with, because for him, he's doing no-till. That's as good as, you can do in many cases. And he realized we need to do better than that. And he's even started to implement some strips on his land, alfalfa strips there, because he wants to have them for forage. But, I think it does highlight that doing some monitoring, showing farmers exactly what's happening on their land can provide some major benefits. Okay. We've also been looking at soil carbon and nitrogen. And so this is from a paper that is now in press, I think with Agriculture, Ecosystems, and the Environment, where Marlene looked at, we had taken soil samples in the top 15 centimeters at the time we started the project, and then she took them, so 05, and then in 2010, so about 5 years later. And what's interesting here is that if we look at the all-crop watershed, we see no difference in soil organic carbon pre-treatment, post-treatment, so no change there. But if we look at, this is the one to kind of draw attention to, if we look at that soil organic carbon where we have the prairie filter strip in 2010, we see a statistically significant difference in soil organic carbon levels. So we're getting an increase in soil organic carbon where we have those prairie strips. We see also increase in nitrogen, total nitrogen, at that foot slope position where we have the prairie filter strip. We look at 2010 versus 2005. And then if we look at it, we are seeing a decrease in the C to N ratio when we look at that foot slope position where we have the prairie filter strip compared to the pre-treatment. So as we start to look at soil quality and soil quality benefits, we're seeing some improvement where we have those prairie filter strips. That might also help us in the future from an infiltration standpoint. If we're building organic matter in those soils, the water holding capacity may increase, and so those soils can hold more water than the adjacent cropland soil. So even within that 5-year period, we're starting to see some benefits, which are pretty encouraging. Okay, so kind of summarizing this, I think the prairie strips have the potential to provide substantial soil and water quality benefits, which I think is critical as we enter a time period when there's a lot more concern about both the soil and the water. NRCS has a new soil health campaign, and so practices that help us improve soil quality are getting traction with them as well. I guess I'm a pretty big believer that the variable width buffer design may have some benefit. Why not put greater buffer area in those areas that have more surface water flow? And I think that can help maximize our benefits. And we are taking the project on the road, I guess, so to speak, that phase 2 of the project is starting with the establishment of a network of demonstration sites throughout Iowa. We have one producer, Seth Watkins, down in southern Iowa, that has implemented the prairie strips, and we're working with a number of other landowners that will hopefully be implementing these strips over the next 12 to 18 to 24 months. And the hope would be that we could do some evaluation on those sites as well. There are folks, Mary's looking at pollinator habitat, Lisa on some of the bird diversity. I'd like to look at some of the water aspects. Do we see similar response on farmer fields, on bigger fields than our 1 to 8 acre in size? I think we'll still see some similar results, but it'd be nice to document that on producers' fields. And this wouldn't happen without funding from a lot of sources. The Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture, IDALS, Randy Kolka's unit, the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station, the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, the SARE, North Central Region Sustainable Ag Research and Education, and AFRI. And we're also working with the University of Iowa on this, the Flood Center. They've started to use some of our hydrologic data for some of their hydrologic modeling to assess the impacts that prairie strips might have for flood reduction, I guess. So a number of different sources. And with that, be happy to have some discussion in the remaining time. Yeah.
I would think that the slope on your watersheds would have a big influence on the results overall. You want to be able to utilize this across the state, so the slope characteristics and even the initial soil characteristics will change the outcome of your results substantially.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So the question was about won't the slope and the soils have an impact, and that's very true, and that's another reason why we want to try to get it on different soil associations throughout Iowa. You know, from southwest Iowa to northeast, northwest, central Iowa. We have a producer near Eagle Grove that's interested even on a fairly flat field. You know, one of the things that we sometimes hear is that, oh, the flat fields, there's not much soil erosion. You know, we saw that last year, that's, you know, that we still see it on those flat fields. And so I think something like this may be of benefit. Maybe we don't need as much area, or maybe we don't need the same distance between strips, but I think they could still be beneficial. And I think the design would be different, and that would be one of the things hopefully we learn more about as we take this out to producers' fields and work with them and with NRCS on the design of these practices.
In southwest Iowa, you see a lot of terracing. How does this fit into a highly terraced topography?
Yeah, that's a good question. How does it fit into a highly terraced topography? If there are terraces already there, maybe not as well. But if there are fields that haven't been terraced, that are maybe in that below the 12% slope range where we think this may work, this may be a lot more cost-effective practice than terracing. How much less are we per linear foot than a terrace on these? Dramatically less. I can't remember it. Dramatically less. Yeah. Yeah, I can't remember. In fact, I just read them today. Chris was working on a report.
It was $25 to $35 an acre for a treated acre
Yeah.
for strips, and it's over $80 an acre for terrace.
For terrace, yeah.
And
So
something else-
so the producers that are in some of those areas where terraces are a common practice, they're very interested in whether these can be an alternative to terraces.
They provide such wider
Yeah.
diversity of benefits than terraces.
Yeah.
And something else you can do in those circumstances is still use terraces, but
Yeah.
to a much lesser extent.
Yeah, that's right.
Along
Yeah.
with the strips.
Yeah, and then we can use terraces on those fields that absolutely need them and use these on many other fields.
The Soil Health Initiative by NRCS, as well as the general interest across the state in cover crops, I would think that that's the next step is for research, is to put cover crops on that no-till
Yeah.
and see what you could do.
I think you're right. One of the things that I realized as I started talking, I wish I would have had in there was, well, actually, let's look at this. This is no-till, right? And in 2008, we still lost 10 tons per acre from those watersheds. Now, a lot of that was in ephemeral gullies down the fall line of that watershed, but, and maybe we need grassed waterways there, but would cover crops provide additional benefits to reduce that erosion down to the leading edge of the buffer? And I think that's exactly a good point, that these practices really may fit in with a lot of the cover crop practices and things that are out there. Yeah. But this was an eye opener, I think, for all of us to see that much soil loss from a no-till field. Now it was only 2 years post disturbance, and so it'd be interesting to. We don't want to ask for that, but it'd be interesting to get that much rainfall in April, May, and June. Further after no-till establishment to see what happens. But we still saw, even in 2010, we still saw about 5 tons per acre of soil loss, which is more than we might expect from a no-till field there. Yeah, David.
So, Matt, how would these techniques be extended to tile drain fields where I see the benefit for surface runoff and,
Yeah.
sediment losses or soil losses, but for water quality improvements, since a lot of that water is being short-circuited and being pushed out at the bottom of the watershed, it's going to presumably bypass whatever buffers are up slope. So how would you modify this to accommodate central Iowa?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think you still have some surface runoff in those areas, and so that can still help with that surface runoff and phosphorus loss. And perhaps we can tie these foot slope buffers in with the resaturated buffer work that Tom and Dan Janes are working on to try to, move some of that short-circuited tile water that's high in nitrate through the root zone of those foot slope buffers. So it may actually work. It could work fairly well, maybe. So still provide the surface runoff benefits, but then trying to maximize the subsurface benefits that we can get in those landscapes.
Yeah, and just along with that, one of the advantages of this is it's highly complementary with other things that can be done. It's complementary with no-till with cover crops. It can be tied into resaturated buffers at the bottom end, and so it's not a silver bullet, but it's like in the context of a suite of different best management practices that can be used. This is a pretty easy, a relatively easy thing to implement and to maintain within the production system.
So I'll tell you, I got a farmer, one of the farmers that's interested in the practice. So Tim, I'll mention this one. So he brought up to me at the PFI conference a while back, I like these prairie strips, but we have people that want to, I'd like to be able to graze that area, okay, to utilize it to get some return. So he's interested in building like a cattle version of the chicken coops on wheels that you see around the yards. He wants a big cattle crate coop on wheels that he can move that's just the right width to pull through the prairie strip, and they mob graze that prairie strip. This is, you probably know who it is, Jerry. So, and he's, he wants an engineering group, an engineering senior students to work on designing him, a concept for a cattle coop on wheels to go through there. So I think that there are ways that, we might be able to utilize those prairie strip areas for some type of return for farmers.
But Gabe Brown gave that workshop at PFI, and he said that they had diversified their livestock operation, and that the broilers were making more money than the cattle.
Okay. That doesn't.
So maybe you grew chickens.
Chickens out. Okay, yeah. That's okay. Yeah.
Perhaps the
Yeah.
comment about the cattle grazing,
Yeah.
and certainly your comment earlier about the guy who wants to, the farmer
Yeah.
who was planting alfalfa
Yeah.
and things like that. Even though we're talking about perennial crops here
Yeah.
and things like that, I'm thinking in terms of below ground and above ground biomass and the diversity of below ground biomass in prairie strip versus in an alfalfa field
Yeah.
and the amount also, of course,
Yeah.
biomass. What differences might you expect in, say, alfalfa versus the prairie?
Well, I think we'd definitely expect more below ground biomass in those prairies, but to know exactly how much, I really don't have a good. I think, so I think that it would, most of what I've shown is in kind of that surface flow. And I think a big mechanism is from the slowing down of that surface runoff to allow for infiltration. And I think the alfalfa strips may do some of that, although the density of the vegetation. So one of the things that governs it is how many stems you have standing up. So what's the resistance to flow, essentially, and the more stems we have standing up, the more resistance to flow that we have. And so I think it really be dictated by what that stem density is. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons that I think the native prairie strips are advantageous over, say, a brome strip is that there's more structural strength to those stems that are standing up. Some of our brome will lay over very easily. versus these the native species. We still maintain that stem standing up.
This is showing your decreased C to N ratio too, so it's showing a large proportion of woody material.
Woodier material, okay, yeah. And so that's why, I think about things that happen in April before anything's starting to grow, and you have brome out there with the snow on it, it's pretty flat, right? If we have, these more diversity of species, you probably still have some stems standing up providing resistance to flow. So that may be one of the things that be kind of interesting to look at, the different benefits you see throughout the season of different vegetative species out there, and we may see a lot greater benefit to some of these in the spring where we maintain more structural integrity of those stems. Yeah.
What have you found has been, I guess, the greatest way to get the research to an applied use where farmers will actually take it on? Like, what do farmers connect with, and how do they, how do you get people to actually take on this practice?
That's a good question, and maybe some others with the research team will answer as well. I think one of the things that has been useful is that we've had a stakeholder group that's met annually on the project, and stakeholders from state agencies to some of the farm groups to other NGOs. And I think keeping them informed of what's happening has helped to a certain extent. Because I think even in lots of offline conversations, they can be supportive of this project and understand the project, and as landowners ask about it, they're kind of informed. So I think that's been a critical aspect. As I'm thinking about our first adopter, I still think a lot of it comes down to relationships and getting to know some of the district conservationists like Doug Davenport that Lisa had acquaintances with down in southern Iowa that kind of brought Seth to the table. And so I think a lot of it still comes down to a lot of those relationships, which are becoming maybe more difficult to establish as everybody gets busier and there are maybe less boots on the ground out there. But I think as we go to kind of phase 2, those relationships and then word of mouth have really allowed things to take off, that we're getting more interest than maybe we even expected in the implementation phase. Yeah, sure.
That having Gary as our cooperator was
yeah.
huge.
Yeah, and so another thing that has probably generated is we've had a number of press releases, or even some of the farm press doing articles about this, and then talking to Gary as part of it. So they can talk to us, and we can say how great these are. But I think the ones that resonate are when Gary says, he's amazed at how much benefit they provide, or he's thinking about implementing something similar on his farm. I think that resonates a little bit more. Yeah.
I guess I just also need to get a shout out to the Leopold
Yeah.
Center, because their communications staff has been critical in terms of, getting a drumbeat of information
Yeah.
out there in front of the public. And it's been so useful that when you do meet people, they're like, oh yeah, I've heard of
Yeah.
that. And they're sort of receptive to the message because they already have heard something about it in the public sphere.
Yeah, because some of that farm press, some of that farm press was there because Laura Miller would send out things to all the network, the spider web of people that she knows. So,
Just one other thing that's going to be helpful is that the way that we've handled introducing the empirical work and the research on the ground is that we've started getting institutional buy-in. So it ties in with existing conservation programming. So EQIP dollars and conservation reserve dollars as well can conceivably fund these. And we've gotten folks on the inside of the NRCS who are really excited about it, and at that level this might be a practice that is recommended above other things that could be used in certain contexts for its advantages over certain other practices. So.
I'm curious about how much maintenance you have done on the prairie areas, or how much maintenance you think they will need over time.
That's a good question, and I would say we've not done any maintenance that a producer would not be able to do. So these haven't been highly maintained prairie areas. So we seeded them in '07. It was not the ideal time to seed them, July of '07. There's a whole host of reasons why it was done then. In '08, I think they were mowed twice to remove the weedy, the above ground weedy biomass. We did some spot spraying for thistles. In 2009, I think we mowed once. Again for weed control. And then since then, it's been, 2010, I don't think we mowed them at all. And then 2011, 2012, and 2013, we have mowed them after the first hard freeze, and Gary's baled that for bedding for his livestock. We've done that just to remove the thatch. We probably would have implemented burning, but we're not. Since it's on the refuge and they don't have the staff to do all the burn out there, they don't want to have to burn these little patches, and we're not allowed to do that. So we've not used burning, but I think a producer could do that.
You're not having like serious issues with thistle
After we did that spot spraying of thistles, we have not had a big problem with thistles. No. I was a little worried, but we, right from the start went out with, backpack sprayers, and the folks did a pretty good job. We have poison ivy in one of the areas, yeah.
Wasn't
Yeah.
there a little woody encroachment here and there? Or
Well, because one of those basswood, one had a lot of woody species before we started, and so I think that's been a little bit of a challenge. But I don't think it's been managed. The nice thing is when we talk to producers, we've not used any equipment that they wouldn't have access to do the maintenance of the prairie strips, and I think that's been helpful as we start to talk to them. Yeah. It hasn't been highly managed for research purposes. So I think that's, yeah.
Is the prairie mix pretty much a mix? More grasses or forests or 50-50 kind of thing?
No, it's, you're asking the wrong.
I guess this is kind of a little patch established.
Yeah.
Right now it was like all forms of flowers, which is beautiful for me.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as your need for your purposes, I'm
Yeah.
just wondering.
It's a pretty good mix, and you definitely see differences in it depending on the landscape position you're in as well. It was a mix that was harvested on site at the Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge. We did spike it with a few species.
Golden Alexanders.
We did something, that was the second year. The first year we did something else too. We tried to get Phlox pilosa, but we couldn't. It was $1,000 a pound, and we couldn't find any local ecotype. Okay, but there was something else I can't remember that we did spike in there. But yeah, then the golden Alexander was, yeah. Was that a milkweed? So it's pretty diverse, yeah. And Sarah Hirsch has published a paper about the diversity of the vegetation in there from Matt Liebman's group.
Going forward, most prairie seed companies have these pre-made mixes, right, for CRP, CP25 or something. A high diversity mix is usually what we at least as a baseline recommend to start off with.
And also, it's probably due to the proximity to prairie, but we have species
Yeah.
coming up that we never planted.
That we never planted, yeah, and that's why it'll be really interesting on new sites to see what the diversity is, where they're not in a matrix of lots of prairie around them.
We planted 35 species, native species originally, and now it's up to 53 on average.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did the refuge furnish any of the seed?
Yeah, they furnished all the seed, other than the little bit that we spiked it with. But the main mix was what Pauline was using in those years for seeding. Yep, and that's really what they. Now, more than that, yeah, that's what we were allowed. That's all we would have been allowed to use because we actually, one of the reasons we have one of those sites is there was. They actually had planted prairie in there one year, and they had found Sericea lespedeza in there. And so Pauline said, actually, you can use these watersheds because you're going to, kind of eradicate them. And but we've still had to do some monitoring for that because that was. So they were very sensitive at that time about bringing any seed in from anywhere else because that was, I think, where they thought they got it initially.
I
just like to interrupt briefly.
Okay, sorry.
We have
Yep.
until 4:30. If you guys want to stay and ask questions, you can, or you can leave if you have some.
Yeah. David.
I have one more question. So,
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
so how, what are future plans, and do you plan to incorporate groundwater monitoring to close the water budget at all in any of these?
It'll probably be difficult to close the water budget. We do want to continue to do groundwater monitoring.